I remember when I was in high school, I asked the teacher, I said, hey, I'm thinking about going to engineering school. What do you think? And she said, well, are you good at math and physics? And at the time, I remember my math class, the homework, I wouldn't really do the assignments, and even physics, I wasn't very interested in the topics because the assignments were just basically like repetitive problem sets, and I was a lot more interested in like story writing and filming and things of that nature, like more creative things. And I told her that, and she said, well, I don't think you should go to engineering school then, because if you're not good at math and physics, then there's no point. And I remember at the time I was like, yeah, I'm not totally convinced. And when I ended up going to college, I did try to study like filming and writing, but I quickly switched to engineering. My intuition said, okay, let's give this a shot, let's see what it's about. And now that I look back on it, the advice that teacher gave me was really bad advice, because it was, and it's kind of not her fault, but basically she had a big misconception of what engineering is. And in her perspective, like, she was like, okay, if you don't have the skills of like doing math and physics properly, you're probably going to struggle in engineering school, and that's okay. But the big problem in that is she totally neglected the part where I told her I was very interested in creative things and drawing and painting and imagining things and trying to picture things in my head. She totally disregarded that. And in my opinion, now that I've gone through a bachelor's, master's, and I'm doing a PhD in engineering, that is the single most important thing to fully enjoy engineering, and that is to have creativity which is fueled by your imagination. And the reason for that is because if you, like, there's this misconception that engineering is just like math and science, and just basically like you crunch out some numbers, you run some programs, you build some stuff, and that's it, you call it a day. But if that was the case, then there wouldn't really be a need for engineers. Now we can just kind of automate all that stuff. And like, for example, with the invention of calculators, things would have become extinct. And as robots get better and better and we continue to automate things, the only thing that's going to be left that's valuable in like the human engineers is the creativity and the artistry. And when I went and I worked in industry at different places, like, I went to the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory for an internship. And in my opinion, some of the best and most talented engineers work there. And when I went there, what I observed is a lot of these engineers are just super creative people. They're very artistic people. For example, there was this guy who was designing antennas, and he would basically have to come up with ways on how to deploy the antenna in space. And based on this challenges, how can we get things to fit in a way? And not only did the creativity lead to a solution that couldn't have just been figured out intuitively by like a robot, for example, a lot of these designs were just very beautiful to look at. Like, I remember there was one lab where there's a lot of geometry of like solar panels and like shields and like antennas, and the geometries were like really beautiful. So not only was it functional, it was just really nice to look at, and I could tell this is like art. This is not just engineering, this is art. And the idea is that really good engineers are just like artists. They are artists, but instead of using like a brush to paint, you're basically using ideas and technology to build the images in your head, to turn the images in your head into reality. And that's really the key idea, is that if you're a creative person, if you're somebody who likes to imagine things in your head, if you have strong imagination, and if you're really curious about some things and you'd like to learn, you'd like to dive deeper, and you suck at math and physics, that's fine. Math and physics are just skills. They're just models. You can learn them. They're like, for example, when I went to engineering school, my ass was kicked the first year. I almost failed my first math and physics exams. And I learned that, okay, if I really want to take this seriously, I need to get better at those skills. And I developed passions for them through getting better at them. And yes, of course, since engineering is applied science, obviously you need to like the science. But I would argue to love engineering the way I love engineering right now, it is really the art part, the creativity, the passion of just imagining things and turning them into reality. Like, for example, my last two papers that I published on antennas, they were just images that came to my head. They're just ideas. Like, I was kind of daydreaming and fantasizing about, okay, so what would it be like if I had this antenna that would deploy and it would do this kind of beam steering pattern? Oh, and I could use a motorized rod, or I could use something to push. I was just literally like daydreaming and fantasizing. There was no math or physics involved in that process. And then as I was picturing that, as the images were coming to my head, I jumped on it and I executed it, and I went and I designed it on software, and then I went and I did the math and physics, as in calculate how big the antenna needs to be, and then calculate like the geometry of the antenna and things of that sort. And then I used the software to calculate like the radiation pattern and basically how the antenna would perform. And yes, that's where the math and physics came in, is that it helps me execute the idea. And then I published the papers and it got accepted and I got really nice comments. But the idea came from this creative, artistic mind, not necessarily the math and physics. So the math and physics, again, are tools that you could learn. And if you're not very good at them, that's fine. You can get better at them. But what is irreplaceable and really tough to learn is the creativity, is basically being able to imagine and daydream about things. And if you have that, that's what I would argue would make you a far better engineer, at least in the long term.